Buonasera,
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the Rimini Meeting 2021 on the courage to say hi. We are privileged now at the end of these 6 days where we met many distinguished figures, where we listened to many people giving us a lot of food for thought on this topic. And we like thinking that in this final session, we can actually enjoy once again all the journey that we have lived during these days and that will continue in the future. We need to have courage. We need to have courage to say hi. That cannot be taken for granted because in general, we think that our I is equal to what we can do, our skills. But there is something missing in this way of identifying the I. And it is interesting to think about I as ourselves. Many times we also forget or crash our I. Sometimes we think it goes against our skills. And sometimes we believe that our I is not able, is not up to the task of being as he would like to be. And there's this strange tension between our inability and our ability. And in this tension, we need to have courage because we need to be aware of oneself, of ourselves. This is why I think that the topic of this last session of the meeting of this year is particularly to the point, education to freedom, because we need to be aware of ourselves in order to be performant. So, tonight, we will discuss together what are the most important topics at these historical times where the world of schools, universities, education, and institutions has experienced a deep crisis. And it is important to understand what are the most urgent needs of education to freedom, whereby we can be aware of I and of the people. And we'll discuss about education to freedom with two distinguished guests. They are distinguished guests and personalities because I think that they are the best people, the most appropriate people to help us discuss about this topic. Let me welcome, first of all, Susanna Tamaro, who is connected with us from, unfortunately, far away. Here I am. Hello. Hello, everyone. I can hear you. Thank you, Susanna Tamaro, for accepting this invitation. Susanna Tamaro is well known. She has written many books, including the very famous Va dove ti porta il cuore, 1994, and the latest book published 1 year ago Una grande storia d'amore. A wonderful podcast has been made on that book before this meeting. Susanna Tamaro is an expert of the human dimension, of telling stories connected to daily life, connected to the soul of people, connected to the desire of people. At the same time, a very warm welcome to Eraldo Affinati, who is here with us tonight. Eraldo Affinati is a writer and a militant teacher. Let's put it this way. He is from Rome. Susanna Tamaro is from Trieste. And he dealt with anthropological, theological, religious topics. And I will recall some books written by Eraldo Affinati, stemming from his own personal experience as an educator. For example, La città dei ragazzi, Elogio del ripetente, L'uomo del futuro, Sulle strade di Don Lorenzo Milani, and Via dalla pazza classe, Educare per vivere. And he will talk about that. We are very happy to have him with us tonight because many years ago, together with his wife, he founded the Penny Wirton School. It is a school of Italian for migrants, which is widespread in more than 50 cities in Italy. Tomorrow, as you will read in many newspapers, and there will be some reviews, his latest novel, entitled Il Vangelo degli Angeli, will be released and will be distributed in the bookshops. And a podcast has also been prepared on that for the meeting. Now, I've spoken too much, and now let's have a conversation with our guests. Let's start with Susanna Tamaro. Now, I've learned from a book by Susanna Tamaro, a book on a Friulian poet, Il tuo sguardo illumina il mondo, your look enlightens the world. So educating means having a look on the world, looking at the world in a very specific way, a look that is open to the world, and making ourselves wonder why. What has the world got to do with me? Why? Most of the times, reading your interviews and your articles on newspapers, sometimes I think that education is only based on a code of ethics, whereas education is a sort of aesthetical reading. As in education also conveys the beauty of the world. What has been your experience on that? You often talk about it. How have you found out that you have a passion for education? Since I can remember, I have thought that the world is full of beauty. I grew up in a city, in an urban environment, but there were different types of light around me. The light of time and the light of the eternal. So I saw the beauty as a mysterious voice speaking about another time, that was preceding us and that was following us. And I was convinced that everyone could see that. When I went to school, I led my life, an ordinary life. I realized that nobody could see the way I saw things. But then I grew up and I understood that I had a passion to tell stories and to tell the mystery of life. And I understood that art has a purpose because it enables artists to share the beauty he or she sees around him or her. I am an elementary school teacher because I've always liked working with kids. I also wrote many children's books, which are quite famous. And I often talk about the importance of the relations with children, especially at times like this, when children are living a sort of Middle Ages. There's a lot of ignorance today among human beings. And when they are 30, people are treated as bins, rubbish bins. Children must be treated since they are very young by cultivating their mystery, by cultivating their ability to perceive beauty, by stopping giving them theory. Many times parents talk to their children in a very philosophical way. And we must enable children to have a different look on the world. When children are born, they are full of noise, ideas, chats. Children today are deprived of silence, and silence is the place where questions arise. And the growth of a human being is based on questions. Without questions, a person cannot develop. So children are surrounded by noise. We give them a lot of answers, but we don't enable them to ask themselves questions. And through questions, people can grow, people can develop. We don't need to give answers. We just need to prompt questions. So we need to take away all the noise around the children, and we need to make children develop, to make children grow on their own. We need to nurture that part of children that is able to be bewildered at the wonders of the world. We need to nurture the mysterious part of children, and only by doing that, the life of the human being becomes a life worth living. We need to educate the heart of children. We need to educate them to beauty, to look, to watch, to listen. First of all, children must be able to listen, otherwise they cannot watch anything. They can't look anything. First, they must be able to listen, and listen to their heart. Children must get in contact with their heart and must ask themselves questions. We don't have to provide them with answers. Thank you for your first answer. Because by prompting questions, answers can be found. Now, let's continue with Eraldo Affinati. Well, I know your story, and I know what you have done. My question is the following. Many times, oftentimes, the constraints and the fragilities, the vulnerabilities of the youth are seen as constraints, constraints and obstacles to overcome. sometimes we don't have the courage to look at them in their face. But as your experience shows, these constraints, these obstacles, and his suffering, pain, social unease, social disadvantage can be mates in life. They are not a constraint. They are not constraints, but they provide an opportunity. How have you found that out? How have you discovered that? Well, it's a long story. We have some time. When I was a child, I was not at ease when I went to school. I could not understand at that time the reasons why I felt uneasy. I was too young. I didn't have the words. I didn't know how to express my uneasiness. And then I understood that behind that there was something connected to the story of my family. My mother, during the Second World War, had finished in German lagers. My grandfather had been killed by the Germans. My mother had escaped. Then my father was abandoned. He had not been, his parents had left him. So behind me, there were roots that had been damaged. My parents just went to elementary school, and I became a writer and then a teacher, because to me the two things go hand in hand. And I became that in order to find the words of my parents, those words that my parents had not been able to find. Over the years, I realized that this was not only my experience, but it was a common experience for many educators. I know that there are many teachers in the audience tonight. And this also applies to parents. We are not only responsible for ourselves, but also for those who have come before us, those who gave us life. So I found the answer when I entered a class as a teacher for the first time. At that time, I realized that teaching could be my life, because I felt I was attracted by the fragile, the disadvantaged. I realized that there was something connecting me to them in order to heal a wound that was mine, that I saw embodied in my students. This is why I taught in vocational training schools. And now we have the Penny Winton schools. They are schools, free schools, schools for free for migrants, with no classes, no marks, no bureaucracy, and no money. And I want to say that because we do believe in the value of free schools. In some cases, there are students coming from Afghanistan who give us, I don't know, an apple or a flower as a gift because they have studied with us. Now, this is the gift. This is the positive feedback that I want to have. And that makes me think about something that happened to us in the past. At the Penny Wilton School, we have students who are trained as teachers. Some of them are volunteers. There are also some students going to secondary high school, and they come to our school to teach migrants. Once, there were some students from a vocational training school, and they started working immediately. They started to work with students from Africa, from South America, from Afghanistan, and I was struck by one of them because he was extremely at his ease. He could have a very good relation with somebody coming from Nigeria. He was a very smart guy. And I went there to congratulate him, and the Nigerian told me, I want to study with him, because he believed I wanted to take the guy away from him. So I went to the professor who had come with the guy and asked her, but what's he like in school? And the professor told me, well, he's going to fail at the end of the year because his marks are very bad. But look at the way he's doing here. Why so? And the professor could not understand why he was so good at the Penny Winton School. At that time, I saw that that fragility, that imperfection, whereby he would have failed at the end of the year in school, he was working on himself, he was working on his imperfections in order to speak to this illiterate Nigerian. He had this imperfection that was a burden for him in school, but those imperfections became an added value teaching at the Penny Winton School. And that was a wonderful experience for me as a teacher. I saw students with learning problems that performed very well in our school teaching migrants. I saw some students from Sicily teaching some Arab migrants living in Europe thanks to online schooling. So we put together two different types of frailty, social frailty and educational frailty. So it would be really very bad if we were all perfect. I'm not selective. I want to focus on those that have most disadvantages, those who have made mistakes. This is where you need to take action. Don Milani used to say that the school is not a hospital treating the healthy, but treating the sick. And in a wrong answer, there's more truth than in a correct answer. Because if you forget the correct answer, well, the correct answer is totally useless. But the wrong answer must not be wasted. The wrong answer can always be useful. I worked a lot on my imperfection. And probably this is the reason why I'm looking for imperfections in others. None of us is alone. Our roots are not just our roots. If I look at the story of my mother and my father, it's like I'm touching the whole root. It's like I'm touching all the human plant, so to speak. During the pandemic, we have realized that we are all connected by invisible bonds, invisible threads. And these threads now must be twined. In this sense, I think that some of the sessions here at the meeting have been to the point. Let's exploit this opportunity. I'm very struck by what you said, because starting from your experience, you said, well, I recovered the words of my parents. Susanna Tamaro mentioned the storytelling, the different forms of expression, the tools for expression. This is how the I can be recounted, can be told. In your case, you work with young people who can't speak any Italian. I don't know what Susanna Tamaro thinks about it, but maybe even even for Italians, Italians have to become owners of their own words. In some of your articles on the pandemic and in some of your articles on education, like you said at the beginning, we are deprived of the silence, and only in silence the questions can arise. We can no longer listen. The fact of becoming owners of our words, how important is it to have an ownership of our words? And maybe you know that much better because you're a writer and an author.
I was not good at all at school, and when I was famous and I had a presentation of Va dove ti porta il cuore, and I remember that I saw in one of the first rows a woman who was very, impatient, and at one point, she said, I was a friend of your Italian teacher, and I'm sure that you could not write this book because you were totally unable to write. So you see to what extent some teachers can be a catastrophe for the weakest people, and they can become burdens. But still, I was able to respond to this woman, most of all, I was able to evolve and to develop the skill to use the language properly. But today, we are mesmerized by words. Words surround us. There are too many. But words need to be connected to a feeling of honesty and truth of the person. Otherwise, words become vain. The big educational catastrophe we're going through depends on 68, because until 68 there was a certain level of continuity in terms of education, and there was the usual learning rebellion ratio. But after 68 it was not possible any longer to rebel, because if you can't rebel, you cannot shape your own personality. You live in a continuous flow of possibilities, but you can't shape your personality. And even, the memory is very important. We are not isolated identity. We are part of a history. And so remembrance is very important, everything that is part of our background. So having eliminated the authority is also horrible. I'm not a supporter of authority, but I think that 68 somehow emptied the sky in a metaphoric sense. But people should first of all question themselves about the meaning of life. Is there a meaning? 3 possible answers: yes, no, I don't know. These are the answers. After 68, the answer was I don't know or I don't know. It's hard to grow young minds in between these two answers. So there was a certain desperation resulting from the lack of a yes answer. And it's not the yes of dictatorships, but it's the yes of a meaning that is determined and defining the relationship to the other. And so this is the laying foundation of any relationship. But without this sense of meaning, of a greater value that is greater than us and that is the good, you can't develop any kind of education, because you can be overwhelmed with words, but this is not education. Education is something deeper, it's something stronger, it's something that somehow really shapes a person deep down shapes a person inside. In order to educate a person, you also need to guide people finding themselves. It's not about total freedom of doing anything you want, everything you feel like doing. So I think that this is the real issue. And Eraldo talked about his family. And I remember an anecdote with my grandfather when I was very young. He came from a very poor family, and he fought in the First World War. He was for years on a trench, and he was really scared by blood because he had seen too much blood when he was young. And I remember that one Sunday we found an Italian flag and we used it as a sort of toy to mimic the character of Zorro. And my grandfather was furious when he saw us playing with the flag, because for him that was a very deep injury. And he got so angry. He didn't say, "Oh, kids, please do not play with the flags," but I will never forget the pain in his gaze. And I learned that time that there are things you cannot play with. So again, education means also showing dismay, showing contempt when needed, but also provide guidance, because it's important to teach to make distinctions between things. The COVID just accelerated and worsened situations that were already there. And so it somehow accelerated some sort of decay that was already underway. So the sky is the father, the earth is the mother. The sky, the father, so it's being eliminated, but the mother, the earth, is very much pauperized, and so everything has been radically changed. So we just have the earth. We just have the feminine part, and that kind of situation generates just crazy people, mad people. So a whole society cannot, go on with such a system. So you need love requires strength as well as education, strength in the sense of determination. So you need constant commitment and engagement. Words by themselves do not change anything. We need commitment. We need to know that there is a good, the other is the carrier of this good, and together we need to fight to protect that good. Without this kind of strong idea, you can't go on. Young people are desperate. Even in the province, you can see these young people binge drinking and wasting their time. They're desperate. They're desperate looking for a meaning for their lives. So the answer are yes, no, I don't know. And the answer should be yes. There is a meaning of life. What I find very interesting is that Susanna Tamaro helped us better understand the essential nature of this issue. So she helped us understand what is at stake, the big question, the why. Has life a meaning? Is there an ultimate meaning that makes that makes life worth living? And the answer is yes. And freedom is not enough. It's not enough to even to tell and share a content. We need to somehow have the opportunity to ask the question just to get an answer. Eraldo Affinati, I come back to you. Recently, we have the impression that there was a sort of difficulty in asking such question. And also when it comes to education, remote schooling seems to have made things worse. Some time ago, in an article Susanna Tamaro wrote, well, remote schooling simply unveiled a problem that was already there, and it is much, much bigger. So, Eraldo, according to your own experience, what do you think about what happened? Was remote schooling just a temporary solution, the response to an emergency, or maybe was that also a new possibility to become aware of some things? I'm not saying that it was good, but, well, in order not to miss out, what should we do? What's your take on remote schooling? Well, I still vividly remember the day we had to somehow stop having in-person classes. I remember a huge room with 150 people sitting one-to-one, and I had to say, I'm sorry, from now on we will try to do it online. And then, of course, we did it because our pupils have smartphones, and we were able to fix the situation. But I remember that that moment specifically when I made that announcement was pretty dramatic. And then I saw vital energy being triggered. So there was very powerful reaction that was brought about the situation. For instance, a deaf Iraqi guy didn't know what to do. And there was a sign language girl that made herself available. And then another girl from a high school in Rome that decided to accompany one of our sort of voluntary workers. So these Iraqi refugee was strongly helped through technology. So I can say that I saw a very strong human response. And for the very first time, school entered into houses, so everybody could see from a close, I mean, what schooling is about today. So everybody had a peep in the backstage, so to speak. Everybody had their say about schooling. So all in all, I think that there were positive sides. Education is very important, and it's very important to have the final session of the meeting with this specific session on education. I find it extremely important. But apart from remote schooling, is it better or worse than in-person schooling? Well, I'm not concentrating on that. What remains, as Susanna Tamaro said, is the credibility of the educator, the word of the educator. So it's like a fortress. I share what she said. The authentic word needs to be a word legitimized by experience. I used to say so, and I know many young people. Why is it so that young people avoid politicians? They do not like politicians, at least the guys and girls from the suburbs that I know mostly. I think that they perceive the lack of authenticity of politicians. So somehow they perceive that these politicians are not sincere. And life and art cannot be separated. Thinking and action need to be combined, as Mazzini said, also the ancient Greek. So if life is not sustaining you in terms of experience, you cannot generate any words. What is word if nothing but a secretion of experience? So words are often vain today, but it's up to literature to go back to authentic words. That's why educators, and I'm going back to this very important topic we touched upon in the beginning, needs to somehow have settled things with themselves. Because if an educator has not cleared somehow himself. He, if still has, damage or unsolved sort of issues, well, you won't be able to have a relationship with anybody else. But what is this kind of insight of educators I'm talking about? I would talk about a choice. And the title of the meeting, The Courage to Say I, reminds me of this choice, because when you make a choice, then you have the courage to say I. I see it every day with young people, because they are at the beginning of their life and they often make mistakes when they choose. But if a grown up spiritually remains open to any possibility and doesn't make any choice, well, that grown up won't be considered as such. You won't be able to be credible vis-a-vis young people. The real choice is a painful choice, is a choice that somehow implies leaving behind something. So it's either or. So you have to choose. So it's really about the choice between two things. So you get one, but then you give up something else. This is a maturity. This is growing up. This is becoming an adult. Even when it comes to some images that you have yourself. So you have to make a choice. You cannot be everything. So an educator somehow embodies this kind of choice. An educator is a symbol of a choice. So all the somehow sort of aftermath of that choice has to be left behind but not forgotten. So the burden of the choice is there with the educator, but you won't come back. So a choice is a turning point that implies no comeback. So the educator has to live up to the challenge of this choice. So then credibility is gained and the educational relationship works. Instead, I see many grown-ups that remain eternally young. It's like a sort of, a sort of excess of desire. But one thing is to click on the web to get some information. Another thing is getting to know the real thing. So when you try and then you fail and you try again and maybe you fail better and you learn. So that's my definition of a good educator. And that's why, in my opinion, schools are so important places, and schools cannot be separate from the world. It's not an isolated place where you go and do something strange, you study. I mean, no, school needs to be a sort of intensified version of life. I hope that in September, schools will reopen fully in person, and so I hope that we will be able to make the most of this difficult experience we are leaving behind us. There is one last issue I'd like to touch upon with you, and especially with Susanna Tamaro, and this links up with what Mr. Affinati has just said. This is about the educational relationship. So the educator is fully committed and engaged. You can educate only if you somehow communicate yourself, if you tell about yourself. The meaning of life we were talking about earlier on is not simply an explanation of things, not at all. It's a different gaze, it's a different look. Susanna Tamaro, what do you think about the need for educators to be educated? How can I educate somebody if I'm not educated first? How can we make sure that educators somehow develop the right attitude, because there seems to be a difficulty in developing educators. I don't know, sometimes we reduce educating to specific skills that are technically learned. But instead, as you said, you need a sort of vibration. It needs to stem from some personal and inner experience. What's your take on this? We do apologize for the technical inconvenience. Probably Mrs. Susanna Tamaro is not able to listen to us. Yes, unfortunately, the connection dropped. So I'm going to ask this very same question to Mr. Affinati. Actually, you already started answering, but I'll come back to you while we restore the connection with Mrs. Tamaro. So, in your experience, was there a point or when you felt educated, or do you feel, as constantly educated? So while we wait for Mrs. Tamaro to connect again with us, I can tell you straight away one thing. When it comes to educating and being an educator, the most meaningful experience is failure. If the educator never fails, he is not a real educator. Life experience says so. When you see that the boy or the girl you considered so promising betrays you, or does not respond as you expected, so somehow that person disappoints you, well, as an educator, that's an extremely meaningful and shaping moment. Maybe that is going to shape you much more than the successes. So when you see that your students are good and they are following you, that could be either good or bad. But when you see a young person somehow escaping from you, this is a truth you need to face. You can't pretend it's not happening. So Don Milani used to say, teaching is about failing. And when he was asked when is going to be a glorious day for schooling, and he said, well, when education and schooling will start being in a crisis. Well, because as I'm saying, this has to do with educators and students, but also with sons. So when the young person you would like to educate escapes from you, it's a moment of awareness, and certainly you will get improved by this failure. Well, and that means that you also need to be loved, because in order to cast a gaze of love. Oh, welcome back, Mrs. Tamaro. Yes, I'm glad to be back. Thank you. So, yeah, another couple of minutes, and I would really like to hear from you about the question I just asked you before the connection dropped. So, when it comes to the educational relationship, the educator needs to be constantly and continuously educated. So it needs to be looked at in order to look at somebody else. Oh, yes, definitely. Well, Eraldo and I suffered a lot when we were kids at school. So I think that this kind of suffering somehow forged us in a different way with respect to schooling, because when you somehow feel uncomfortable and deprived, you understand disadvantaged young people much better. And when you grow up, you develop your own personality, and you also want to be like an example for your students. So you decide to give yourself with great generosity, accepting defeats and disappointments. And maybe then pupils react in unexpected ways. But usually, trust usually pays back. Sorry, there's a phone ringing. And I mean, this applies to all human beings. So you need constant ongoing education. If you are not ready to adjust and correct yourself and be open to change, well, you can't go on. And I realized that when I was starting to age while I started to have certain ideas. So the important thing is to always be able to change, to be open to change, to put yourself at stake with love, sincerity, and honesty. Well, then you keep young inside. Instead, if you just cage yourself in routines and rituals and fixed notions, well, then young people will ignore you, because young people just want to be seen. But if you do not watch them and see them, well, there is no educational relation. Well, I have the impression that this evening's conversation was able to pinpoint some key messages that we should take from the pandemic. So I'd like to make a brief recap. The times we're going through have been defined in different ways. But in a very important session, we had Ron Williams, Charles Taylor, and Caron conversating. And in the era of secularization or of nihilism, in order maybe not to be unclear. So this is a time of uncertainty. So we take somehow for granted autopilot is somehow triggered, and otherwise living seems impossible. But of course, this is something that is not sustainable. So we always need to question ourselves about the meaning of life. And for a long time, we have complained about the fact that young people do not read any longer. Young people are not able to tackle specific issues because they are more and more absorbed by technology. However, this evening we heard that there is still something that can make the difference, and this difference can be made by another person that puts themselves at stake. And I just want to go back the beautiful image of Susanna Tamaro when she realizes that mystery is looking at us, that reality is watching us, because mystery is part of our reality. It's not just an intangible and mysterious reality, an abstract thing. No, it's just reality knocking on the door of our eye and asking simply to be acknowledged. And this is what triggers our questions. There was an exhibition devoted to TV series in this meeting edition with extreme cases of young people that are going through deep, discomfort. They are in a deep crisis because they are not able to acknowledge a gaze that was able to love them, to acknowledge them, as Eraldo said. So as what they are, and simply for what they are, and not for what they can do. So this is the big challenge of education. It's up to us to rediscover this. And yes, there is another concept that I want to go back to, and that was raised by Mr. Affinati. We simply have to say words that have been legitimized by experience, because we can perceive the mystery around us, but we can say I if we acknowledge that, because you can say I when somebody addresses you as you. When somebody says, hey, you, and you say, who, me? So that's the I, and that kind of relation triggers the start of any experience. I really deeply thank Susanna, Tamaro, and Eraldo Affinati for this deeply moving encounter here tonight. I remind you two very important podcasts on the Gospel of Angels and A Big Love Story, the two books respectively by Affinati and Tamaro. Well, this session is a very special session because it's the final session of the meeting 2021. So I'm not the one supposed to officially close the meeting, but I think that the person who should close this meeting's edition should be the president of the meeting, Bernard Scholz. Good evening. I'd like to thank both Susanna Tamaro and Eraldo Affinati and Costantino Esposito for this beautiful session, for their precious testimonies. And this session is an extraordinary bridge from this meeting to next year's meeting. So educating through freedom. Next year we will commemorate the 100 years of the birth of Don Luigi Giussani, who gave his life for us to be free. He wanted to educate us to freedom. He wanted to guide us to the encounter with the presence that makes us free. So I'd like to share with you the presentation of next year's title, quoting a speech delivered at a meeting on August 28, 1985. And he said, Christianity was not born to establish a religion. It stems from a passion for every human person, the veneration for every human person, the tenderness for every human person, the passion for every human person, the absolute esteem for every human person. Every human person is in a deep relation to infinite. So a passion for every human person means a passion for freedom, the freedom of every human person. So the Title of the meeting 2022 is A Passion for Every Human Person. We would like to rediscover together this passion. This is a passion for me, for you, for each one of us. This is not a general passion. This is a passion that has to do with everybody's life, regardless of our specific situations. This is a passion that wants to set us free. And Don Giussani embodied this passion. So next year's meeting will also be a great opportunity and occasion to encounter again and meet again Don Luigi Giussani. I thank you all. I hope that this year's meeting will accompany you for the rest of the year through the encounters that you made here, the sessions that you listened to, and see you next year from August 20th to 25th, 2022 here at the Rimini Trade Fair Center. Thank you very much indeed.